Preston Singletary Aksayi Tlingit Kena Kochain Duasak Kagwantana Hutsati Sialakwana Achat. That's the extent of my knowledge of the Tlingit language, and so I will switch over to English for the rest of us here. Anyway, I would like to say it's an honor to be here, and thank you all for pivoting to join us here at this space. I'm honored to have this exhibition here within this land, which is the home of 39 indigenous tribes. And so it's really a very distinct honor of mine to be here and to be welcomed amongst all these people. And I would like to introduce Miranda Belarde-Lewis, the curator for the exhibition Raven in the Box of Daylight.
Keshi koto tsuna kenawe. Ho tsatsana titsa lechina. Hom skik lechina. Hom dachu anadin doakwe. Excuse me. Hom dachu anadin doakwe tap hom tita anadin daktin tan. Look at dawan karo tap wichita tap is emma ahoi. Leith awan ulak nawe sesho Emma getsana. So thank you very much to Preston. Thank you very much to the Museum of Art for everyone that made this evening possible, coming from near and far. We really appreciate your flexibility and your flexibility with this evening's program.
So we're kind of going off the program a little bit. We have a very gifted storyteller who I'm very good friends with, and he happens to be here because he's in my band. And so he was here today, and I would like to invite him to come and speak and tell the story Raven in the Box of Daylight. He's a traditional storyteller, and this is a very special thing. A bonus, I would say, because he can tell the story in a much better way than I can actually tell it. So please welcome Jean Tagaban.
Gonna teach, ewe hai ade. Achunk gonna teach. Hoo 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 hoo. Each way on a good way, your way, Canonik. Raven was walking along the beach, and it was the beginning of time. The world was dark. The stars, the moon, and sun were kept in boxes by a wealthy old man. He lived at the headwaters of the Nass River. The fisherman of the night told Raven of these treasures, and so Raven went to the house of this old man. Raven went to the house of Nashak Ankawu. And it was there that Raven saw Nashak Ankawu's beautiful daughter drinking water from the stream. So Raven had an idea. Raven changed his spirit into a tiny hemlock needle. And when that beautiful daughter dipped her ladle into the stream, Raven floated down and fell in her cup. And when she drank that water, she also swallowed Raven. And soon she became pregnant and gave birth to Raven in the form of a human child. Now everyone loved this child, everyone except the mother-in-law. You see, it was really the mother-in-law. She knew that this child was the spirit of Raven, but nobody listened to her. Nobody listened to that mother-in-law. And still to this day, you'll still find that nobody listens to the mother-in-law. So Raven, that child with the spirit of Raven was going to get the stars, moon, and sun for all the people of the world. That child pointed to the corner of the house, the box containing the stars, and he began to cry. And Nashakaka would go, no. But he gave in to him. He took that box down and placed it in front of his grandchild. He says, you don't open that box. And that child looked up at him with his big eyes and went, oh. So he played on that box. He sat on the box and he danced on that box. And when nobody was looking, that child opened the box, and out of the box flew the stars into the nighttime sky forever. My precious objects are God forever. But he couldn't be upset. He loved his grandchild. The child with the spirit of raven pointed to the other corner of the house, the box that contained the moon, and he began to cry. No, you can't have that box. But he loved his grandchild, and he gave in to him. He took the box down containing the moon, and he placed it in front of his grandchild. He says, you don't open this box. And that child looked up at him and went, oh. So he played on that box. He sat on the box, and he danced on that box. And when he opened that box, he took that moon. He took that moon, he tossed it up. He tossed it up, and he tossed it up like a ball, and he tossed it up, and it went out the smoke hole into the nighttime sky forever. Oh, God, my precious objects are God forever. Oh. But he loved his grandchild. He loved his grandchild. Raven is patient. He's very patient. Raven pointed to the other corner of the house, the box containing the sun, and he began to cry. And no, you can't have that box. No. And he kept crying and crying and crying. And he cried so much that he got sick. And he got so sick that the people thought that he might die. And with the beautiful daughter, she picked up her child and said, Father, is there anything worth more than the life of your grandchild? Oh, my dear, oh, gonna away, oh, hey, Koti. So he took the box containing the sun and he placed it in front of his grandchild. And that child played on that box. He sat on the box, he ate on the box, and he slept on that box. And when nobody was looking, that child opened that box, and out of the box flew the sun into the nighttime sky forever. Oh, Kati, my precious objects of God forever. Yes, Ashakakau. Ah. But when nobody was looking, that child with the spirit of Raven changed his spirit back into a bird again. And he took the last box, the one that is called the box of daylight, and he started to fly out that smoke hole with him. As he was flying out that smoke hole, he yelled out, Spirit of the smoke hole, grab Raven, grab him, hold him there. And Raven was struggling, trying to get out that smoke hole. You see, Raven was white. He was originally white, but as he was stuck in that smoke hole, the soot started to cover Raven's feathers, and it became black. And Ashakakau says, release him, my smoke hole spirit, release him. And Raven flew into the nighttime sky, looking like a little hunk of coal. Now Raven was walking along the beach, and he had the box of daylight with him. And he came up to the fishermen of the night, and they had a fire, and Raven says, give me your food. And they says, no, go away. And Raven says, I freed the stars, moon, and sun, are the most precious gift in here for everyone. Now give me your food. And the fishermen of the night, they said, go away, you're Raven, get out of here, go. And this made Raven upset. So Raven, he opened that box of daylight, and daylight flashed throughout the world. Those fishermen of the night, they ran away and hid. They were scared. Some hid in the sky, some hid in the forest, some hid in the waters. The ones who hid in the sky became all the birds of the world. The ones who hid in the forest became all the animals of the world. The ones who hid in the waters became all the fishes, the creatures of the waters. And then there are those, the ones who stood up straight and tall. They stood up straight and tall. And they saw their world clearly for the first time. And they marveled at the beauty of it. And this is how Raven brought daylight to the world. Ooh, gonna teach.
No pressure for us.
Believe me,
now.
that's a much better version than the one the way I tell it. So that was a special opportunity that was very unique. So I don't have to tell the story very much, but I will lead you along with
With what you will see tomorrow
Yes.
and the other days up
Exactly.
until May.
So this was Raven and the Box of Daylight at the Norfolk, Virginia venue, with the stars beckoning you to come into the exhibition. So I guess I can tell. There's many questions that I always get about, like, well, how long did it take for you to make this exhibition? It took me about 3 years to work in my spare time, as I like to say. Because I am a practicing, studio artist, and I have assistants that help me execute all of these pieces. So in any case, when I conceptualized this particular exhibition, I wanted it to be an immersive experience, and I met a man named Walter Porter in 2003 at the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian, and he was introduced to me by a mutual friend of ours, Clarissa Hudson Rizal. And so actually, it's your auntie. Forget that part. Walter, he said, I've seen your work, I've seen what you do, and you have this opportunity to reach a broad audience with your work. People are paying attention to what you do. And I had made a raven with the sun in its beak for the inaugural opening of the National Museum of the American Indian. So from that day forward, I'd spent many times with Walter, who was an elder from Yakutat, and he was a mythologist. He would take the Tlingit stories and he would break them down into their basic archetypes, and he would use them kind of a Joseph Campbell kind of perspective to recognize the symbolism within the story. And so this sculpture here, this totem poles are meant to actually tell a story. That's their purpose. So because we come from an oral tradition, this is part of our visual language. And so this glass sculpture that I created represents the Raven in the Box of Daylight story. So you have the raven on the top figure here, and then you have the old man and the daughter represented in this story, and the box that contains all these precious treasures that are owned by this old man, the head of the Nass River. The story begins, and the world is in darkness, and the raven is a white bird. And in most native cultures, an albino animal represents a supernatural being. So we've already heard that raven has powers of transformation, and he is able to assume different forms. So I tried to make this exhibit sort of an immersive experience. I wanted people to feel like they were in a different place, maybe in a different time. So we talked about this old man, or we talked about the fisherman who told Raven of the old man who has these treasures in his clown house. And so this is how I represented the fisherman of the night along the Nass River. And so this is where Raven learns about these objects.
And just to give you some context for the images, you're going to see this is the 5th location that this exhibition has traveled to. And so right now you're looking at it at the Museum of Glass in Tacoma, where this exhibition originated from and started off its run. And so when you're thinking of multiple venues, multiple locations, it also reinforces for us every time that we travel to these different places that make sure that everyone knows that this story was built out of 5 different versions of the same story. And so there is from 4 different storytellers. You heard another version tonight, and Gunath Chish to Jean for for telling another version of it for you to hear. And so then the details in there, like the details of the mother-in-law, right? The details of the fire, the details of what Raven did to gain access to these boxes of treasure, these precious things that were owned or hoarded by the wealthy grandfather. All of those details are unique to Jean's telling. And there's different details that are unique to all the different versions of the story. And I talk about some of those in the catalog, which is also available for purchase in your amazing store. We met the store manager this evening. And so when you're looking at the images, when you're looking at the different sections of the story, we pulled from different versions so that way you could get our version that we put together to tell the story. And we've been asked many times, how did you pick this? How did you decide this? And how did you decide what to tell? And how did you come to this point in the story? It had been told before. It had been told before. Everything that's in the story that you read, that is our version of the telling of Raven and the Box of Daylight, came from an elder, came from a storyteller. And so we took an artistic liberty drawing from our own heritage as Tlingit people to decide what was going to be the best to show off Preston's incredible artwork, and also would build in that immersive feel to walking alongside Raven as Raven is in the story.
Yes. So, I mean, I spent many years as my evolution as an artist. I started to study my own culture through reading books. I grew up in Seattle, not in Alaska. So, story of how my great grandmother moved to Seattle in 1923. And from that point forward, the whole family grew up in the Seattle area. So, as I was trying to find my own unique identity within the material of glass, which is a completely, long-winded story there. I'm not going to get into, but I connected with the cultural, I started to dabble in the cultural perspective of the art in 1988. And that was, as a sort of a journeyman glassblower, learning how to make these forms. I mean, this is a kind of an evolution of the skills that took for me to learn how to make these things. So, continuing on with the story, one of the versions of the stories that I had heard was that the raven goes to this old man and asks, can I come, can I come and visit? Can I come into the clan house? And the old man's like, oh, no way, go away, you can't come in. And so at that point, he had learned from the fisherman of the night that this daughter was, the beautiful daughter would go out and gather water in the morning to drink from this natural spring. And one of the details I learned by speaking with other people who were knowledgeable of the story was that the daughter is actually transparent, and she has no name. And I have no clue why that is, but that's another version of the story that I heard. So I made the daughter in transparent glass and I believe that also represents that she is also some kind of supernatural being, that she's somebody that is special. And so,
Let me interrupt you real quick. Walter, that Preston mentioned, was always finding similarities in the symbolism. And so that was one of always the ones that he latched onto and shared as his point of we are all more similar than we are different. And so he would always say that there's this other story. And as we looked into the different versions, in one of them, I'm giving them a spoiler alert here, that moment is called the Immaculate Conception. And so we've even had really philosophical discussions with different museum patrons who have said, well, the Immaculate Conception isn't about that moment. The Immaculate Conception is about Mary. And so depending on how pious you are within the Catholic and Christian faiths, yes, that is that moment. And this is also a reference to Mary's supernatural status, the mother's supernatural status, that this couldn't have happened in this moment if the mother was not as special as she was.
And so Raven decides to transform himself first into a speck of dirt. And the daughter goes out and scoops up the water. And one of the versions I had heard was that because she's a noble status, she has attendants or servants or whatever. So they are testing the purity of the water, and they draw a feather through the water, and they discover this little speck of dirt. And so this represents Raven, who has assumed this form, a speck of dirt. And so they toss the water out. One of Walter's kind of ideas around that was that there's sort of a purification. The water is a symbol of the subconscious, this tossing out these impurities. We talk about Native American sweat lodge, where, we're purifying ourselves by sweating, and so forth. But so in the story that I've iterated here in this exhibition, Raven the second, so he reformulates his plan, and then he changes himself into a hemlock needle. So this is the idea: Raven deconstructing himself and changing into the hemlock needle. And this time, the daughter goes out to gather water. She swallows the water, but she doesn't realize the hemlock needle is there. So Raven is now inside of her. And then Raven transforms then into this human child. So he's growing inside of her. He's transforming the
Well,
road.
and in some stories, the daughter, they keep trying to get the water clean, and they can't. And at some point, her mother says, "Just drink the water. Like, stop being picky. Just drink the water. It's not gonna hurt you." And little did they know, change the world.
So now this is the idea of Raven transforming into a human with this form here. This is a traditional sort of transformation mask. It's often used as storytelling within the context of the way that we tell stories. So there's Raven now growing inside of the woman's body. And so it's sort of a hybrid, humanoid Raven human transformation. And one of the stories was, we're talking about the Immaculate Conception myth. Walter often would say that, he used a lot of theology in the context of the storytelling. He would draw parallels to it. And he goes, I'm not a religious man. I'm not in ministry or anything. And we're going to use this reference here because I don't want to think that the Christians can hog Jesus all to themselves. I love that, because this, it just basically, to me, tells that we all arrived in the same way, but from different angles. There's this sort of the human consciousness around this story. There's so many teaching moments or teachable moments about it, or within the story. And so this is the part of the story where the woman is trying to give birth, and she's having a really difficult time. And in the old days, what they do is they would dig a sort of a pit out back behind the clan house, and they would line it with furs. And then the child would be born on these fine furs. And she was having difficulty giving birth, and the medicine woman comes by and says, "Take away those furs and put in goat's beard moss. Put moss in there." And so in another way, that also talks about a humble birth. So these are points that I really like to bring forward because Walter, passed away before. Initially, Walter and I were going to work on the exhibition together, and he passed away. And so that's when I invited Miranda to come and talk to work with me on this exhibition, and it was a perfect fit. Um, we had a really great time working on this exhibition. Um, so yeah, so let's see, the humble birth.
Humble birth, the pit, the switching out the furs.
Yes. What else was I going to say? Anyway, it symbolizes the humble birth, and so
And when you
then
look
the
at this,
child is born easily at that point. So
and when you see this in the exhibition, look at the detail in the bowl because that is reminiscent of the way that the goat's beard moss looks on the trees. And it is a medicinal plant for people of the Northwest Coast. And so we're trying to bring in as many different elements from the Northwest here to you.
And so the reason I chose to use video within the exhibition was to change the space and also illustrate elements of transformation. This was the work that I did collaboratively with Juniper Shui, who helped me design the exhibition and also helped me with the backdrops, and the video elements to sort of elicit the whole change of place and what have you. So that was the sort of animating that period of transformation for Raven changing into a human child. And that's how he gets into the clan house. Now he's a family, he's part family, so he is all of a sudden inside the clan house.
And big shout out to Juniper Shui because Juniper is the exhibition designer as well. And so the way that it fits into every exhibition space is Juniper making sure that the projections are lining up, that the objects get the most the visible, and because it's a linear story, there's been a lot of innovation in the way that indigenous curators are working. And a lot of times it's in a circular way, so that way you can enter in at any point. And we didn't do that here. There's a start and there's a finish. And if you walk along from the start to the finish, you get the most benefit and the most, the story makes the most sense. And so for Juniper to help us tailor every single space to the story, the way that we want you to experience it is no small thing. And we thank him a lot.
So here's a detailed shot of the old man, Nashakan Kau. Now that the raven is allowed to be inside the clan house, he's interacting with this is the old man inside the clan house.
And Dorothy Grant is a Haida clothing designer who designed the clothing of the women, the husband and the wife that you see in the clan house.
And this is the mother of the young daughter.
Raven's grandma.
Yeah. So this is sort of bringing some human presence into the space of the clan house. So this man is a wealthy man. He has a lot of material wealth, and he's sort of presiding over all of his objects here. So what I spent many, many years, before I developed my work really very fully, I used to try to make objects that were, traditionally made in wood. So I try to mimic them and in the material of glass. And so these objects were kind of more traditional shapes and forms, rattles and baskets and hats and combs and all, what have you, a variety of things to sort of show some of the traditional objects that, this man might have owned.
And when you look at historic photos of Tlingit clan houses, they're staged. So then they have all of the baskets, all of the carvings, everyone in their finest clothing, standing like they're just hanging out on the side. That wasn't every day. But for the photographs, that's what made the photographs especially incredible. And so that's, can you go back?
Oh, sure.
So then this is our homage to those photographs. So then the stepped shelving and then the way that everything is piled up there on those steps is how it would appear in those old photographs from the late 1800s, the early 1900s. And so when you see this in the exhibition, you're also, when one functions as a homage to those historic photographs, it also serves as a mini survey of Preston's work. And so then you can see the different styles of hot sculpted, sandblasted glassware that he is famous for.
So these are sort of dance staffs that I created, Eagle and Raven. The Tlingit tribe is split into Eagle and Raven, and those are the two main moieties. It's a matrilineal society, and under each Eagle or Raven is the crest or clan symbol, crest symbol. And my particular crest symbol is killer whale. You see a lot of killer whales in my work. Some of the rattles, so some detail shots of the objects and using different techniques, tricks of the trade, I like to say, to bring these details into form. And, as my skills had, evolved, I was able to make more and more complex things. This is actually called a tana, or a money piece, and this represents the high status of an individual. So yeah, exploring all kinds of different techniques and trying to render the traditional object in different ways. So now that Raven is inside the clan house, he's finds these boxes. The first box is the one that contains the stars, and as Gene did it so much better than I could, talks about how he plays with the box and he's kind of walking around with it, and finally one day he opens up this box and he takes the box of or he opens up the box and he takes the stars and he tosses them through the central smoke hole in the fire within the clan house. And of course he's reprimanded, he's kind of punished, and he's because he did something, he lost these treasures to the old man's treasures to the world. But the stars, they take their place in the sky.
For all the engineers in the room, there is independent light sources that are underneath these custom-made boxes. So then the glass box sits on top of these custom cases that have light sources that are illuminating the boxes from the inside.
So of course the second box contains the moon, and what does he do? He opens up that box and he tosses it through the smoke hole into the nighttime sky, and that takes its place in the sky forever. And then he's again scolded, and when he points to the last box, the one that contains the sun, the old man says, no way, you're not having that one. And he, that's when he starts to fuss and cry, and he's driving everybody crazy. He refuses to eat. He becomes very weak, and then the daughter brings her son to the grandfather and says, is there anything more important than your grandson? And he realizes, of course not. So he puts the box in front of the child and says, don't open the box. Of course, this is when Raven is tired of being in human form, so he decides to transform back into a bird. He takes the son, and he, in the version that I tell about this story, is that the old man realizes he's been fooled, and so he instructs the men of the house to grab Raven, and so they're grabbing onto his tail, and he's flapping away, trying to get away. and they hold him over the central fire pit, and he instructs the men to throw pitch onto the fire, and that's where the black smoke comes up and turns Raven from a white to a black bird. So this is, the moment in the story where Raven transforms back and he's taking the sun and he places it in the sky, and the people scatter to the different realms, into the water, into the air, into the forest, and so I like to say that is sort of the origin of the clan system. So you have different birds, and you have the forest animals, you have
The water,
yep,
the water animals.
the water animals. And so over time, these symbols have been adopted as the crest symbols of the family. So I like to say that it's sort of like the origin of the clan system.
In that moment when Raven is just overcome with greed, as a greedy little child, and wanting these treasures that are being denied to him by his grandfather, and they keep on he keeps releasing the treasures, right? And so then you heard in Jean's story, the grandfather is just in anguish because his treasures have been released into the world. They're no longer his. But he keeps on giving the grandson whatever he asked for because of forgiveness, because of compassion that he has, and the love that he has for his grandchild. And that was one of the things, one of the universal messaging that Walter always made sure to let us know was happening in the story. That there's this love that the grandfather has for the grandchild, where he wants to provide, he wants to give him what the grandchild wants. And that knowing that we give people the things, especially those that are close to us, the things that they want because we love them, even when it hurts us, is something that really came to mind. As we were finishing up the exhibition, I read The Tao of Raven by Ernestine Hayes, who is a Tlingit author. And in that story, she recounts, it's a memoir, so we're not quite sure who she's talking about in her story. But then she has the Raven in the Box of Daylight story running parallel. And in her story, she's talking about somebody hurting a family member, emotionally, and that they can't bring themselves to say no, that they keep forgiving, And as we were talking, the different stories have influenced this exhibition, and Ernestine's The Tao of Raven really influenced me, and how we were telling the story about that moment of compassion that we have for family members that might do things that hurt us sometimes. And so to see that love come through in ways that affect the entire family dynamic. And in her story, Ernestine talks about how must it have felt for the grandfather to realize that this precocious, precious child is not actually his grandchild. Yes, it was born from his daughter, but that's Raven. That's Raven, and he tricked all of them, and he released his treasure. So what was it like for the grandfather to have that moment of realization? And no wonder he turned around and inflicted irreparable changes to Raven, because when he held him over that fire, he took away his supernatural status. And we were very careful to phrase it that way, because one possible interpretation of changing from white to black as a consequence of releasing the treasure could be seen as anti-black. And that is not our understanding of the story, and we don't think that that's what was the intention of the ancient stories. But because modernity, colonialism, racism has influenced so many different tellings of ancient stories, we wanted to be extremely clear that that is not what was our interpretation of what was happening in the story. And so seeing it more as a consequence of action, of behavior, and stripping him of that supernatural status was the consequence. And so now we do have ravens in the world, we do have blackbirds, and we do have light in the sky with the stars, the moon, and the sun. And all of those are consequences that have been collectively, we are collectively the beneficiary of Raven's actions towards his grandfather.
Yeah, I mean, this is often called a creation story, but actually there was a lot of things that existed before Raven. I like to say that Raven brought order to the world. And it's just a different way of kind of expressing it, but it's he kind of set things in motion. And I like to say, like, Raven went in with one plan and he kind of failed up. Like, he tried to do one thing and he inadvertently, brought, daylight to the world. He didn't know what was going to happen. And it's interesting too, the things that Walter, that I always like to make a good light of, is because, back to the theological representation, is sort of, the world is in darkness and Raven brings the light. It's like people would say, Jesus is the light. And, we don't think of Raven, so much as a Jesus figure per se, but he did have this power to shed light. One of the most interesting things is, like, when Walter would talk about, he would get people going, in the audience. I can't really see you because the lights are so bright, but he would say, so what happens when, in an old, cartoon, when somebody gets a really good idea, what happens? What happens above their head? A light bulb. Okay, so he would say that is a metaphor that everybody understands. Or if a child is, in school and doesn't understand something, and he asks for the teacher to shed what on it? Shed light. So that's kind of how Walter would bring people along. He says that, these stories are things that you can all understand, and that's what happened in the old days when we were storytellers, and that was the only form of entertainment that we had. Today we've got a DVD or whatever, we could flip it on and watch it over and over and over. But that's how our stories function. They were told over and over and over. And Raven embodies all the best, or all the best and worst parts of human nature. I like how Gene was telling the story. It's like, okay, so the people, they scatter into the different realms, and the people who stood up strong and proud, they became the human beings. And another version of the story is just like people who stood there bewildered and didn't know what to do and didn't choose to run. They became the human beings. Okay, so maybe that sort of is a commentary on the folly of humankind. So there's so many metaphors that can be brought out within the context of the story. Got any more?
I got lots more, but I think we're getting close to time, and I think that they wanted to take some questions.
What place does Raven have now?
Ooh, good question. Oh yeah, it's like Coyote, right? Trickster. I mean, Deer Woman's still around, right? I saw her on Reservation Dogs. Like, so the tricksters never leave, but they do transform, and so we're not exactly sure what form he's taking. But I think Preston might be working on some interpretations of that. The tricksters.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And
tricksters
so
never
I
go
started
away.
to ask, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I started to ask the question in my own mind, like, what's Raven up to now? I mean, if the culture hadn't been interrupted, and with colonialism and what it did to our indigenous culture, there could have been more stories that might have come out around Raven's actions and what he did. And so I asked myself, when is the next Raven's story going to be allowed into the annals of Tlingit culture? I don't know. And there are certainly novelists who have written stories about Raven. So I started to think about, Raven must be still around us and he's still trying to elicit some kind of a change, or he's maybe trying to help out in some way, continue to show us the light, point us in the direction of the light. So I was thinking maybe Raven's trying to battle climate change, or maybe Raven's trying to protect the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Maybe Raven is discovered the residential school grave sites. Maybe he did, he did these things. He's also still showing us things in different ways. So that could be, in the twilight of my career, I'm going to start to think about this and make artwork that pertains to those kinds of stories. So I'm thinking about that a lot right now.
Yeah, and there's so many authors that are exploring this. I just listened to The Last Powwow by Stephen Paul Judd, and that Indian Thomas, who I don't know what his full name is, but in the book it's that Indian Thomas. And so it's such a crazy story. If you haven't read The Last Powwow, it's a trip. And it's wild to think about how there are the supernatural events never stopped. And beings like Deer Woman, like Raven, like Coyote, the different Nana Bush, like the different tricksters of the world. I mean, we're looking at Marvel, looking at Loki, right? And so the tricksters never stopped. And so what are they up to now, and what kind of things are they stirring up? And it's a really fascinating thought to think of, like, what maybe somebody accidentally caused climate change, because
Exactly.
the tricksters are never really working on things that benefit everyone. They're usually a selfish motive, and they just accidentally change the world.
Raven's always driven by hunger. He's always
Right.
trying to find something to eat.
Yeah. Jordan, did you have a question?
Yes. I wanted to say thank you so much for bringing this incredible exhibition here to Indian Territory. It's such a beautiful example of the breadth and the depth of storytelling. And but I also wanted to ask, you mentioned a little bit about the collaborative nature of gathering these different stories from elders and maybe multiple generations. Can you talk a little bit about working in collaboration with Indigenous communities, with maybe different clans, in representing this to the world?
Thank you, Jordan. Could either of you repeat that?
Jordan said we're awesome.
I heard
That
it
was
too,
the first
right?
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And was wondering about the collaborative nature of how the stories got put together, because I did mention that this is 5 different versions by 4 different storytellers, and the stories that we drew from the most were spoken in Tlingit, in the Tlingit language, and then they were recorded, and then they were transcribed and then translated. And because both of us do not speak Tlingit, we relied on those language warriors to come up with the depth and the detail and the humor and the really biting points of that are sting a little bit, that plays out in that nuance of language. So if you speak any other language, you know that it's really hard to translate that adequately into English. And so the people that worked on it are just so incredible. And some of it is driven by the art, right? And so then thinking of the different ways that Raven tried to get into the water really inspired my favorite piece, which is the feather. The feather with the speck of dirt is exquisite. And yes, it is all glass. And so it's just like, that's one of the ways that we did it. But it was really important to me to make sure to honor our inland Tlingit families, because there's coastal Tlingits that is very famous and well known, but there's also inland Tlingits that are lesser known because they're landlocked. And there's trade, there's marriage, there's all these different networks that bring our communities together. And the language too, there's different dialects, but some of the tellings that we drew from are from the inland Tlingit to make sure to honor them because they're our family too.
Here in the middle.
I wonder if you could spend a little time talking about the incredible technique that you've developed to express with glass and what the advantages are to you, what that glass enables you to do things that you would not be able to do with other materials.
The question was, actually, Preston, please. I'm giving up at this
I
point.
didn't quite hear I couldn't quite hear it clearly enough.
Working with the medium and how you've mastered it technically, and how you're working with it and expressing with it today. Is that fair? You've developed a unique technique that's incredible.
We ought to know something about that, but also what the glass enables you to do that you can't do with other forms.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, glass was my first medium. I started when I was 19. Basically, dropped out of high school and was trying to make it as a musician. And I had a really good friend of mine who, got me into glass blowing. First as a production glass blower, and then I started to work with on a team that worked with many different people. I gained my experience through, I learned everything through working on teams. The whole idea of collaboration. Glass blowing is very collaborative. It relies on a team to make much more complex and detailed things. And so my whole life has been a collaboration, and I eventually gained the skills to render these forms in the way that I do. And I tried wood carving, and I just wasn't very good at it. So, I figured it would take me a whole lifetime to get good at that. And so I said, why don't I just stick to what I know? There's only, you can only get good at so many things, and that's my motto. And so so I stick with glass to see what I can, how far I can push it, and the fact is that glass brings another dimension to indigenous art. It's a very unique experience that I have because there's a very limited number of Native Americans working with glass. So I found myself in this position to, I gained a lot of attention for what I do almost prematurely, but it put the fire under my behind to sort of like really step up and do it in the right way, which caused me to, get together with people who were knowledgeable, who could teach me about the design. So I had some quantum leaps to sort of not only figure out how to blow glass and do this sculptural form, but also to get real with it and sort of connect with elders who could, validate what I was doing, who would encourage me and teach me. Learning about the mythologies and the history was another, thing. So all of these things, I'm not, completely knowledgeable of everything, but I've got a general sense of it. So in the end, the fact is that glass has a potential to last a millennium. We have, 3,000-year-old, examples of glass. So that potential for it to live for that long, but it can also break in a heartbeat. So, people think that glass is fragile, but it's also very strong. So I just decided this is my my dharma, I'm living the life that I should have lived, because as much as I wanted to be a rock musician, rock star, I fell back on my art career, and that's and then I use the money that I make from my art to help finance my music habit. So Those of you who might come to hear the band tomorrow night out at FAM, you'll get to experience that.
And then a point on the glass, the innovation of his work through this exhibition, because he worked on for 3 years to create the pieces. I worked for 4 years with Preston, with Juniper, and other folks to curate the exhibition. And before that, he had the idea with Walter for years before that. So it was almost a 10-year process from this idea to when we opened at the Museum of Glass in 2018. And within this exhibition, you can see the evolution of his ideas and these quantum leaps that he's taking. And so these pieces right here are a way that Preston innovated within this show itself. And so we saw the baskets, we knew about the heads, but we knew about the hats, the sculptural forms, the fish, the rattles, the dishes. But these with the bust, you know, because this is a full chest and these are larger than life. So when you see them, they are so impressive. And that's something that he innovated within this show. Another one is the canoe with the glass panels that slide into the steel frame of the canoe. The engineering that went into that alone is like, if you can't tell, I'm a fan of engineers. Because to figure that out is a totally different process than the art, and it's totally different process than the writing, and it's totally different than the research. And so all of these things work together. And the other one is the mobile. So then the mobile, you know, is inspired by Calder, who is inspired in, you know, all the other modernists, right? Modernists are inspired by primitivism, which is taking from native art. So it's this full circle moment in many different ways. And the other aspect to that, the flip side, is there's this really silly debate between art and craft. And like craft isn't art. And so then to see the way that the pieces that Preston makes that are referencing traditional or customary pieces like ladles or feast dishes, spoons, weaving combs, those are not functional as rattles. They're not functional as a weaving comb. He has elevated them to the status of capital A art. And so it's pushing all of these different boundaries and pushing the fields to acknowledge, no, there's indigenous innovation that's going on at all times on multiple levels. And you're all here because you recognize that. There's a lot of people who don't. And so it's really encouraging to see all of you be so excited to see this innovation and to see the ways that we're pushing the limits, because there really is no limit. We just have to have somebody be the model for how to do that. And we see that in Preston's work all the time.
Preston, you touch on a lot of your biography, especially in your newly released book, Fusion Notes. Back to that question about the medium, I'm curious about the practice of wood carving, that tradition and that practice, and how you translated it with sandblasting in the medium of glass. Was there an aha moment, or was there a process moment? Was there something for you, how you transliterated that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the first sort of beginning steps was to learn how to draw the designs. The fact is that there's an architecture to the design system that allows you to take these simple elements and sort of expand them, build on them to create what looks like Northwest Coast art. The first beginnings, I was tracing designs out of books. I didn't know what I was doing. And then I found people that could help me understand how to make an original design. And it's possible once you master the basic elements of the design system. And different from carving a piece of wood where you start with this block and you kind of reduce it. When you're blowing glass, you have to blow the form out to a specific proportion, and then you end up, you know, so when I make the work, it's always after the piece is cooled to room temperature, which involves covering it with a rubber tape almost entirely, and then drawing directly onto the form, cutting it out with an X-Acto blade, lifting out the tape, exposing the areas that are going to be carved, and then in a sandblasting process, you just wear the surface of the glass down to define the design area. And so, working with layers of color, working with the stencil process, and then the simple, it's nothing I invented. I've been more innovative, I suppose, in the shaping of the forms and then applying the design work to it. Sometimes, this whole exhibition is sort of like one aspect of what I do, and I also go more into the modernist kind of abstraction, and that's where I find a lot of freedom, and I make stuff sometimes. Sometimes I go into the studio, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'll just start to put a line down, and I'll stare at it, and then I'll and then I'll build a form within it, and then sometimes a face might have to go there or whatever, and and sometimes it's just about the design work itself. And my mentor, Joe David, would say, he does work like that sometimes. He goes, "This piece is wonderfully non-representational." So I like to play in that realm too. So I kind of go back and forth depending on how I feel on the day.
Over here, please. Yes. Yes.
How do you decide when a piece you're making is finished?
How do you decide when a piece is finished?
Because you can sometimes go too far, or you know what I mean?
It speaks to me. It tells me I'm finished. It's a lot of trial and error. Sometimes I'll make pieces that, I have a shelf full of stuff that I make. I like the process of blowing glass, and I'll make these abstract forms, and then I might make a flat vase, sort of a decorative, modernist era vase form with a long neck, and I'll just put design work on it. Some pieces sit on the shelf, and they might sit there for 10 years, and then all of a sudden I'll pick it up. It's like, okay, I know what to do with it. So it kind of goes in many different directions. I think now that I just turned 60, I feel like I better get more specific about what I'm doing here. So far it's been kind of like, I'll just go blow glass today and whatever comes out is fine. But now I feel like this more of a prime directive, like what am I going to do in the next 10 years? I'm going to I have to, I have these ideas about Raven. I have these ideas about objects. I don't know if I'll have another, museum show on this scale. It would be, without proper financial support, it's almost impossible. I kind of, but in any case, those are some random thoughts about that.
I see more hands, and I've paid too much attention to the front, and I saw some hands in the back. Please, in the center.
I actually had a question that's been answered, so I just want to make a statement, and I want to tell you how grateful I am that your exhibit is here. I saw your work in Tacoma several years ago, and I saw I did some of the pieces here. I actually saw it in exhibit, and I came back saying I would give anything to Oklahoma City to see that work. So I'm thrilled that you're here. Both of you, it's been wonderful this evening. Thank you.
Goodness, sheesh.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm
On the front row.
honored and flattered.
Please.
I just wondered how long does it take for one of your forms to cool before you can start working on it?
So the question was about the cooling and the annealing process, Preston. How long does it take? And
What? Yeah, it's generally it depends on the form. if it's more thick and sculptural, then it maybe takes long. It takes maybe 2 days for a blown sculpture to work, to cool to room temperature. Some pieces can basically cool overnight, if they're very even and, the wall thickness is just so. I do make pieces that are much more massive, and I have a piece that was a 8-foot totem pole that was in the kiln for about 10 weeks and took about 9 months of cold working to uniform the surfaces, but that's a different story. That's much, much more a different process. It's a lost wax casting process. So those pieces, but generally in my studio, those pieces take about 2 days to cool, I'll say, in general.
Perhaps, Preston, we should explain for everyone that when you finish a piece and it's blown and it's still hot, what has to happen?
Yeah, no, that's true. So the basic nature of having to cool these pieces is that glass is going from a liquid to a solid, and so it's changing its molecular structure. So when it's molten and pliable, and you shape it, that you put it into the kiln, it's about roughly 9 or around 1,000 degrees. That's the point at which the glass stops moving, as long as you've put it in away at the right temperature. So, trial and error, you kind of figure out, when's the best time to put this piece away. And then you put it into an electric kiln where it's cooled in a controlled environment. So that's how you temper the glass, essentially. So, if it cools too quickly, it could fracture and break. So you want to cool it slowly.
There was a question right here in the front.
Please.
Okay, I'm just staring and I can see Chihuly and I have glass pieces at home. I don't picture that as glass because it's not reflective.
Transparent.
Yeah, so that help me because is this clay or is it?
Yeah, no, there's so many different colors that you can work with, and there you have a variety of transparent colors and opal colors, and so I play with the variety of those different color values. I mean, we have about 300 or 400 colors that you can work with, and so you can see the amber is actually transparent, but because it's frosted, it has this sort of matte quality to it, and it's kind of uniformed in its texture. Some elements are actually shiny, but anyway.
There's only
Please.
about 6 or 7 pieces in the entire exhibition that have elements that are not glass, and they're usually hair or cedar bark, pounded cedar bark, or the clothing, or the mannequins, and the canoe, right? The glass portions you can see because of the color, but the other parts are steel, and so everything else, everything else is glass. It's a very common question.
I see some moving bodies, so we're getting anxious, and I'm going to say one more question, then I have a final one. Kristen?
Hi, Miranda. I wanted to learn a little bit more about what your experience was like curating an exhibition with pieces that didn't exist at the point when you started.
The question was, what was it like to curate an exhibition before the objects, the pieces even existed?
It was scary. And it was, I am also to blame for that because as we were still finding stories and talking with storytellers and talking with knowledge keepers, they would say, oh yeah, and in this one version, and then I would tell Preston, and Preston's like, oh, let's do that. Let's do that. Let's do that. Let's do that. And then at one point we realized we don't have any white ravens in here. Wait a minute, we're talking about raven going from one state to the other. There's no white ravens, so we need white ravens. And then there was another point when we said, well, there's no black raven. Wait a minute, where's the black raven? And so then we just kind of kept adding on, which the Museum of Glass, we probably stressed them out way more than it stressed me out. I work with artists quite a bit, and so I'm used to the necessity of a flexible timeline and a flexible just way of being, because there's time is a construct already, right? And then there's Indian time, which we're on now here in Oklahoma, and then we also have artist time, and
Sorry.
and then we have native artist time, and you just have to be calm. You just have to be and know that somebody is going, and have faith and trust. And for the years that we worked together, we built up quite a bit of trust. And so knowing that I was going to do my part, Preston was going to do his part, Juniper was going to do his part, the museums were going to do their part. And so this collaborative nature just keeps on going, and then trusting that the message is also received well. That's been a big part of it too.
That answered, I think, what was going to be my final question. Preston, we celebrate you, but I wanted to pose it to Miranda. How has this collaboration changed your practice? How has it changed your approach to what you do?
It reminds me to go back, and to go back to your research, to your work, because I'm an assistant professor at the University of Washington, and my work centers Native art and how we communicate, how tribes and indigenous peoples communicate information and knowledge intergenerationally within our own communities, and cross-culturally when our art is consumed by anybody outside of our communities. And so being able to come back to the story and come back to the pieces and come back to have conversations like this with Preston is just, I learn more every single time. And so when you think you know something and then you could revisit it again, you're like, whoa. And just having life experiences in between each exhibition has influenced the way that I see the work and the way that I see the art. And so it's been such a privilege to just keep coming back.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.